Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with our weekly lecture series. I want to thank our sponsor, Thomas E., possibly related to Sheila E., but I doubt it. Thomas E. wants a very specific lecture on Hungarian chess players from the 20th century. And so there were a couple of Hungarian players who half their career was in the 20th century, half their career was in the 21st century. So I decided not to do those because I think I already have lectures about them. Peter Lako and Judah Polgar. Obviously, two of the greatest Hungarian players who ever lived, if not the two greatest, but probably I would put this guy first or second, Lajos Portisch, which you can see on the screen. Portisch was born April 4th, 1937, and my dad was born April 5th, 1937. And my dad knew that, but I don't think Portisch does. Portisch, unlike a couple of our other people that we're going to discuss today, is still alive, and he's 87 years old. And qualifications speak for themselves. He played in 8 times in the candidate cycle. He set all-time records in chess Olympiads. He tied for first or was clear first in the Hungarian Chess Championship 8 times. And he played in 12 interzonals between 1962 and 1993. So that's an amazing record for one person. And he was a good chess player in his 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And he doesn't play chess anymore. But that's good because these are the greatest Hungarian players of the 20th century. Played in the World Junior Championship in 1955 and finished 4th place. The winner was Spassky. And Wikipedia talks about him doing well in the Hungarian Championship, world title candidates, cycles, tournament successes. There's a picture of Portisch from 2005. Teams that he's been on representing Hungary in the Olympiad and the Student Olympiad, and him winning gold medals and bronze medals and silver medals, and so forth. And he has a lot of famous games. He also has a lot of famous games that he lost because beating Portisch was like a very difficult task. So if some world champion or strong grandmaster beat Portisch, it was like a known game. I didn't know this, so I actually learned one thing from Wikipedia on the Portisch, that his nickname was the Hungarian Botvinnik. And I've never heard him called that. So I like that that's his nickname. That's a good nickname. Okay, so we're going to go back and forth this lecture between Wikipedia and ChessBase because I have 4 grandmasters I want to talk about. So I want to talk about the grandmaster, then show the game I want to show, and then I want to go back to Wikipedia, talk about the second grandmaster. And there's 4 persons we're going to talk about because that should last 45 minutes. And I put them in the order I thought of their greatness. So Portisch I put number 1, so we'll discuss him first. And first game is Portisch versus Petrosian. I tried to show a game where the Hungarian player of note beat a world champion, although I couldn't do it for one of the Hungarian players, but I had him beating a super grandmaster, so that's close enough. The other games I'm going to show how the Hungarian player we're talking about beat a world chess champion. Okay, so this is Portisch versus Petrosian in 1967. Portisch has white. They played an exchange Slav, which would indicate it's going to be a boring game, except for one thing. So they got all their knights out. And at this position, Petrosian played an unusual move, which I actually played in the U.S. Championship against Jesse Cry and ended up drawing, e6. And e6 is sometimes a passive move, and sometimes it's an aggressive move if black tries to win the two bishops by playing knight h5 later, which didn't happen this game. Okay, e3, bishop d6. This is actually what I did against Cry with black. Bishop g3, castles, bishop d3. So white's obviously slightly better because black's bishop on c8 isn't very good. Rook e8. Seems like black might want to play e5. Knight e5. I guess he's not going to play e5. Bishop takes. Pawn takes. Knight d7. Black is attacking the pawn. So white has one move that looks reasonable to me. And that's f4. Now Petrosian did a double attack. Played queen b6. And that attacks the b pawn and the e pawn. And typically, I would ask my student a trick question. I would say, do you think he defended the b pawn? Do you think he defended the e pawn? Or do you think he defended both? And the answer is none of the above. But Portisch said, yeah, you take a pawn, and I have the two bishops, and you have the two knights, and your bishop on c8's no good, your rook on a8's no good. So I don't care about that pawn. So he castled, saying, take a pawn if you want. What do I care? And Petrosian took the pawn I would have taken. I don't like queen takes b2 because I would be worried about knight a4 and knight b5. Knight a4, queen b4 seems okay. So probably knight b5. The knight can come into d6. Knight can come into c7. I don't really mind sacrificing my b pawn. So he took the e pawn with check. That makes more sense to me. King h1. So Portisch sacrificed a pawn, and black's pieces, except for the queen, are very passive. Probably, even though the black queen is aggressively placed, it probably doesn't want to be on e3 where it can easily get attacked. So Petrosian moved his queen back to b6. Portisch played queen h5 for obvious reasons, attacking h7 pawn. Petrosian followed Larsen's advice. You never get mated with a knight on f8. I guess Larsen didn't see this game. Rook f3. And I mean, it's funny because Portisch is known as a strategical player, logical player, plays a lot of theory, doesn't make wild sacrifices, and yet he's just playing caveman chess. Bishop d3, queen h5, rook f3, rook's going to go to h3 or g3, and he's just going to play for mate. And black's pieces aren't well placed to stop mate. Knight g6, blocking up the king's side. Bishop f2, attacking the black queen. Queen went back to d8. In the instance that black would take on b2 either now or next move, even though the rook is attacked, the knight really isn't attacked, because if queen takes knight, white has bishop takes or bishop h7 check in the previous position. So white could just play rook b1 here, or he could play rook f1 like he did in the game. Okay, so queen d8 was played. playing for defense against of the black king. Knight b5. Portisch decides his knight will be well placed on d6. I can't argue with him. Knight e7, knight to d6. Petrosian played one of his famous exchange sacrifices, bishop d7, and said, you take my rook and you won't have much of an attack. Your knight won't be on d6. Black has a passed d-pawn, although I would take white in that position. But this position, I also wouldn't take the rook because I feel white's knight on d6 is better than the rook on e8. Rook on e8 is no good. Knight on d6 is fantastic. So Portisch plodded along with his kingside attack, played bishop h4. You can't take the bishop because then h7 is hanging because it unleashes the latent potential of the bishop. So the knight's pinned. This knight is really good. Bishop's good. Here comes the rook. Queen is well placed. Black is very passive, etc. Portisch probably surprised that Petrosian put his queen back on b6. The idea is to take this pawn and get counterplay, and more importantly, to unpin the knight so the knight can go to f5. Always play knight f5. Rook h3. Portisch revs up the attack. h6, stopping any tricks on h7. Bishop f6. Now, if you take the bishop and I take on h6, I'm threatening queen h7 check, queen takes f7 mate. And the defenses to that are not good. Rook f8 hangs mate in 1, queen h7. Knight h8, also bad because you play bishop h7 mate. Queen takes d6 is bad because it loses a queen. But if I was a betting man, I would say the computer would probably play queen takes d6 because it probably avoids mate and just loses a queen. So that's not acceptable for Petrosian, of course. So Petrosian took on b2, attacking the rook. Rook went to f1. And white's attack plays itself. And white has a big threat here, which Petrosian temporarily stopped, but it was very temporary. Played knight f5, which prevents white's threat. And after bishop takes f5, the threat is no longer defended, and there's nothing to do. You're down a piece. So Petrosian resigned in this position. The threat, which white had last move, was after takes, we take on g7. And that's why Petrosian played knight f5, also known as knife f5, to defend the g7 pawn. And after bishop takes, black resigned because if Petrosian takes the bishop, bishop takes g7 leads to huge material loss for black or getting checkmated. If you take the bishop, I check. This is the only legal move. Check again. This is the only legal move, and then checkmate. So after bishop takes f5, Petrosian doesn't have a defense to bishop takes g7, so he resigned. So not Petrosian's best game. Played queen b6, queen e3, queen b6, queen d8, queen b6, queen b2. And other pieces were very sad. And you can see white has a massive attack. So hopefully, if the Wikipedia article didn't convince you, this game beating Petrosian right after he played a match with Spassky for the World Championship, Petrosian was one of the top 5 players in the world for sure, and he was world champion in the 60s. This will convince you how strong Portisch was. Okay, our next Grandmaster, back to Wikipedia, is Zoltan Ribli. And this is actually quite funny. It's a big coincidence. Portisch was born one day before my dad on the same year. He's one day older. Ribli has the same birthday as me, but he was born way before I was. He was born 18 years before I was. So he's 18 years older than me, and he always will be. So I'm 55 and Ribli's 73, and we're both born September 6th. Ribli was twice a world championship candidate and 3 times Hungarian champion. Not as good as Portisch, but pretty good. He was twice the European junior champion when he was a junior in the 60s and 70s. He became an IM in 1970 and a GM in 1973. Ribli was twice a candidate for the World Championship. He played in a high-profile match in '84, USSR versus the rest of the world, and his USSR opponent was Rafael Vaganyan, and Ribli was able to win that mini-match with Vaganyan. Go rest of the world, I guess. Then they had a quarterfinal match in '83 where he beat Eugenio Torre and then lost to Smyslov in the semifinal. And Smyslov then lost to Kasparov, and Kasparov eventually became world champion, of course. He won many tournaments in Europe, beating lots of the world's top players. And I've seen Portisch once or twice at tournaments, but I saw Ribli at the 2011 World Junior Championship in Chennai, India. He was a coach, and I've seen him at the World Youth. I don't know which year or which tournament he was coaching there too. So he's done playing competitive chess, in slow chess, but he's still a coach for the Hungarian junior players. Between 1970 and 1994, he represented Hungary in the Olympiad almost every single time. And when Hungary won the gold medal in '78, he was board 2, and he won team silver medals in '70, '72, and '80. And he's also author, and he's married to a women's international master, Maria Grosch, which I didn't know. So you learn something new every day. Ribli's article in Wikipedia is very short compared to how good he is. Ribli was top 10 player in the world for a long time. And after Portisch, he was the second best player in Hungary for a long time. And then probably in the late 80s, early 90s, he was better than Portisch because Portisch was getting older. So Ribli at some point was the best player in Hungary. Let's see. Okay, so you guys are like, I don't think Ribli's any good. So we'll show you a game he beat Karpov positionally. This was played in 1980, or is it 1990? No, 1980 in Amsterdam. 1980, Karpov was really good. And Ribli and Karpov were born the same year. They're both born in '51. So they would have both been about 30, not quite 30 this game. So Karpov, 1980, almost at the peak of his powers. Okay, so Ribli's white, and Ribli, I think, is like a mini Karpov, sort of like Portisch is like a Botvinnik, the Hungarian Botvinnik. Ribli's like Karpov, just Ribli's not as good as Karpov, except for this game. Ribli played the Catalan, which is popular today. They played a main line, which is still played today. Okay, and he played bishop f4, which used to be the main move, and I think bishop d2 has overtaken it. And he let Karpov double his pawns to get control over the e5 square. Karpov equalized by playing queen c8 and c5, trading everything on c5. And this ending looks pretty drawn. But Ribli likes this position because he has a nice knight, and the bishop is sort of awkward. Black bishop can't really do very much. And since black has played b5, and white hasn't done anything like that on the queen side, there's some squares, that white can come into with the knight. f6, never play f6. And I assume this is a drawn endgame, but you would expect if Karpov has a drawn ending against somebody, Karpov's going to play for the win, but actually the reverse was true here. The dogs agree. Wow. Okay, so very slow and methodical. You can't play king e7 because knight c6 check. Something I pointed out earlier. Got to watch it there. Okay, a4, traded. This looks pretty drawn. And then in this position, white played rook b7 check. Now you can see, since Karpov played g6, f6, e6, the king doesn't have a lot of shelter. Conversely, the white king is safe from any onslaught of the black pieces. Well, Karpov is either going to lose a pawn, because his king's defending one of the pawns, and I'm attacking another pawn, and you can't defend your e-pawn if you move your king, so Karpov played bishop e7. Now, in this position, black is not threatening rook takes a4, because then white would play knight c6. So Ribli played rook a7 and said, well, you can't take my a-pawn, but I can take your a-pawn. So Karpov tried to trade all the pawns off and not lose a pawn. Now Karpov has two pawns attacked, and this one would win his rook. So Karpov played rook takes a4. Now material's equal, but white still has the better rook and the better minor piece. White has a protected passed pawn on e3. Knight c6. And now Karpov has to lose a pawn because his bishop's attacked. And if you defend with the rook, I can take on a6. If you move your bishop, I take on h7. So no matter what Karpov does, he loses a pawn. So he did this. Made a threat against e3 with the f-pawn pinned. King f3. Plays the move king e4. And in this position, there's a very complex line which Karpov didn't go into. So if you play rook takes f2, and I'm doing this without an engine, so I might have to stop in the middle and correct myself. Knight e5 threatens knight d7 check and knight g4 check. The truth hurts. So the only good move I see is king e6. Then I play knight d3. Actually, you could play rook f5 here. I could play knight takes g6. Also a good move. The line I was looking at was knight d3, rook c2, rook c7. But we could play king d6 there. So probably in this position, Portisch would have played knight takes g6, or not Portisch. Ribli would have played knight takes g6. Okay, so looks like he could have taken on f2, but Karpov played bishop f8 because always play bishop f8. Rook a7, bishop d6, f4. White's using his extra pawn. Rook a6, putting pressure on the whole 6th rank. King f7, knight e5 check. Now everything's hanging, the bishop and the pawn, so he has to take. And in this position, White's not interested in taking this pawn. White wants to play rook check on a7, and then king f6. Karpov doesn't want his king stuck on the back rank. He plays king g7, puts his king on h6. And this is 2 against 1, but I have a passed pawn, and I have a better king, so I'm winning this position. King f6. Yeah, and it's obvious that black is losing here. Black's king is no good. Karpov tries to improve his king. And end of the game is very nice. This position, when Karpov played king f6, he probably didn't realize he was in zugzwang here. It's a funny zugzwang. So Ribli just played rook d7, stopping rook d8 check, and said, it's your move. And Karpov said, I don't want to move, so I resign. If Karpov moves the rook anywhere, rook f7 is checkmate. If Karpov moves his king, then this wins the king and pawn endgame, and then some. So the only move that doesn't lose instantly is g5, and then I take, and your king's on g5, which is no good. Need your king on f6. And then that's the end of that. The king was on f6 here. We could play rook takes e7, but king's on g5. So after rook d7, Karpov's in zugzwang. Karpov got Karpov that game. White was like equal, then very slightly better, then slightly better, then clearly better, and then winning, and it took over 50 moves. So a brilliant win by Ribli against a tough customer in Karpov. Karpov at his peak, at 29 years old, played in Amsterdam. Okay, we'll go back to Wikipedia. We'll get to our next guy, Gyula Sachs. He passed away in 2014 at the early age of 62. He, like Ribli, was born in 1951. And one time in the candidates, Sachs was paired with Nigel Short, a match that Short won. And Short said before the match, there's no such thing as safe Sachs. He said Sachs was a dangerous opponent. Yeah, Sachs liked to mix it up. He played twice in a row in the candidates tournament, winning the Interzonal in 87, or qualifying. Also at the Manila Interzonal, 87 and 90. He was eliminated in the candidates by Nigel Short. I actually was at that match. I saw them play. And in 91, after extra time, he lost to Korchnoi. His best world ranking was tied for 12th. In 1989, he died of a heart attack. And Judah Polgar wrote a tribute to Sachs. One of the greatest chess players of Hungary. Treated me as a fellow chess player when I was 9. Would analyze positions with me, etc., etc. Mainly, etc. So Sachs was well regarded in Hungary. He was a candidate twice. He played on the Hungarian Olympiad teams in the 70s and 80s. And possibly in the 90s, possibly. And also his Wikipedia is ridiculously short for somebody who was top 12 in the world. I mean, Sachs was a great player. Okay, so he beat Smyslov more than once. This was the game that I liked. Let's see, flipboard. Sachs had the black pieces against Smyslov. This was in Tilburg, 1979. And in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Tilburg every year had a Super GM tournament. Okay, so Smyslov in 1979 was still quite good. And they played symmetrical King's Indian style. And they got a very boring position where it seemed completely equal, which is a Smyslov specialty. This is actually funny. Like, Portisch beat Petrosian in a wild and crazy game, which isn't Portisch's MO at all. Then Ribli beat Karpov in a Karpovian game. And now Sachs beats Smyslov in a Smyslov-like game. You could see Smyslov have either color in this game, and you would expect him to win because this is the kind of positions he outplayed his opponent. Always play bishop f8. This position seems equal, except it seems that black is dominating d4 more than white's dominating d5. So white goes to d5. Eventually, black wins the d pawn, and white wins the e pawn, and they get symmetrical pawn structure, where it seems like black has an advantage in the center because white's rook is on a1, and black's pieces are all in the center. But it doesn't seem like anybody should win. This just seems like it should be a draw. Yeah, I don't like the move knight e3. That lets black's rook go to d2. So I don't like that move from Smyslov. And then in this dead equal looking endgame, Sachs just ran his king up on the queen side. First he attacks the pawn, so knight e3 is forced. Now all these dark squares are open for black's king. And so he moves his king up. And white probably shouldn't have taken time to play h4. He let black's king get all the way to the 6th rank. Probably thought this was defensible. c6, stopping knight d5 check. Now, obviously, black is much better here. Black's king is on the 6th rank. Smyslov's king is on the 1st rank. Not so good. f4, he's hoping Smyslov takes on f4. He'll take on h4, and he'll have a passed h-pawn. Smyslov don't fall for that. Black wants to play knight f5, but doesn't like the counterplay with knight takes c6. So he plays c5 first. They trade some pawns. And unfortunately for Smyslov, Sachs gets to win a pawn on the king side or queen side. He ended up doing both. Knight f5, attacking the pawn on h4. Now Smyslov is a pawn down, and Sachs is going to play knight check and win this pawn and have 2 extra pawns. So black mainly won this game because his king was so much better. And Smyslov resigned here because the knight can't stop the 2 pawns. And white's in zugzwang here. If it was black to move, I'm not sure what black should do, but it's white to move, and I definitely don't know what white should do. If white moves the knight, that lets both of the pawns move forward. And if white moves the king, then my c-pawn can start coming. And with my 2 extra pawns, you can't sack your knight for one of the pawns because then you'll still be losing. So I don't know if the game was adjourned or Smyslov had enough, but Smyslov resigned. And that was a very Smyslovian, a word I made up, type of game that Sachs won. Very impressive. Okay, and the last Hungarian Grandmaster I want to talk about is Andras Adorjan. And I played a couple of New York Opens with Adorjan. We never got paired. He passed away 2 years ago, actually. And unlike Ribli and Sachs, he was born in 1950. So those guys all grew up together because those guys were born in 1951, with Portisch being the elder statesman, of course. Adorjan wrote some chess books also. And one of his chess books was famous because of the title, Black is Okay. So he wanted to show that, you can play black in chess and everything's fine. He was the European junior champion in 69-70 in Groningen. And also in 69 in Stockholm, he was runner-up in the World Junior Championship to none other than Karpov. Karpov was born in 51, and Adorjan was born in 50. His highest peak rating in the world was number 20, so not as good as the other Hungarian players, but number 20 in the world is nothing to sneeze at. He played in Chess Olympiad in 78. He helped Hungary capture the gold from the Soviet team in 78. He further played in 84, 86, and 88 and got Hungary to the top 5 finish on each occasion. And I didn't plan this. This is the 4 GMs that I knew about that I wanted to talk about that played chess in the 20th century, because the sponsor wanted me to discuss Hungarian players in the 20th century. But this paragraph in Wikipedia, it's like I wrote it. He said, compatriots Portisch, Ribli, and Sachs were also at the peak of their playing strength during this period. That's the guys I was talking about. So that's everybody in Hungary that we're covering in this. Yeah. He died at the age of 73. It doesn't say how he died. In one review, it was suggested Adorjan's books could have been co-authored by Botvinnik and Monty Python. I don't know what that means, but I like that. I wish I could write a book like that. Adorjan cited the games of Miles and Morozevich as a source of inspiration. Oh yeah, he wrote, Black is Okay. I didn't know the name of the second book, but I knew it was similar. And the next book was called Black is Still Okay. And there's a third book, which I didn't know about, Black is Okay Forever. I've never heard of that book. I knew there was a second book. Okay, so Andras Adorjan, and I couldn't find a game where he beat a world champion, but I did find a game where he beat Tony Miles, and the game's fantastic. So, okay, Miles is white, Adorjan's black, that's why black's at the bottom. Miles played knight f3. This was played in the Riga Interzonal 1979, very important tournament. And they played a hedgehog, very standard hedgehog, except instead of playing knight bd7 in the normal position, Adorjan played knight a6, which seemed to transpose. I guess if you play knight d7 here, you're hanging your d pawn. So I guess you have to play knight a6 and go to c5. Okay, so this is just a normal position in the hedgehog. Black puts all the pawns on the third ranks and says, come and get me. So Miles comes and gets him, b4. It's a standard hedgehog formation for black. If somebody says hedgehog and I don't know what white did, this is what black does. Every piece that black has and every pawn is on the optimal square. If you're talking about a hedgehog, this is what you're talking about. So if you ever see a hedgehog game, black's position should look exactly like this. White could have a pawn on e4, could fianchetto his bishop, could play b3, could play bishop f. White, I don't know what white's doing, but if black plays the hedgehog, this is what black is doing. Okay, bishop b2, doesn't like his bishop on a3 anymore. Queen b8, trade bishops. Rook c8. White played f3. wants to play either knight e4 or f4 or e4 or g4. And black counterattacked on the queen side with b5. Typically in the hedgehog, we try to play b5 or d5. And d5 is usually more difficult to play because white has a lot of stuff on d5. So b5, they trade on b5. Now this opens up the rook for Adorjan, which is very important. Queen d3 attacking the b5 pawn. Knight e5 attacking the queen. And the idea is the knight is defending a2 and b5. So if you take, I can get my pawn back. He took, and black played queen a7, sacrificing a pawn. He probably didn't like the endgame from this position because white can play rook check, and then white has a passed pawn, and maybe something like takes, and well, not knight c4 because the e pawn's hanging. This seems okay for black too. Maybe there's something I'm missing, but it seems like Adorjan could have played queen takes queen, but with white playing the move f3 and opening up his king, decided to keep queens on the board, which was a good decision. e4, queen e3, queen back to f1, g5, Adorjan wants to play g4. He's just playing for an attack against white's king, and white's pieces are sort of clumped together on d2, c3, and b2. They're not really well placed. Rook c2, that looks really clunky also. And then rook takes a2 is a tactical shot that I'm sure Miles saw, but he miscalculated. The idea is if you take the rook, I take the rook on c2, and Miles played knight d5 and probably thought he's winning because white's attacking everything. White's attacking the queen, white's attacking the bishop with check, white's attacking the rook with check, and Miles probably thought Adorjan miscalculated when he played rook takes a2, but Adorjan actually saw further than Miles. A brilliant move, rook takes a2. Now he sacrifices his queen, and the queen sacrifice turns out to be really good for black because black has double rooks on the 7th rank. Material is almost equal. White has a rook and a bishop for a queen, but white's threatening the knight on d2 with both rooks, and g4 is coming, and knight f3, knight takes e4, and white can't stop it. White's king is not well placed. Miles has to defend his knight, then g4, threatening take on f3 and win white's queen. f4, knight takes e4, threatening rook takes knight, winning white's queen. Knight f1, knight takes, rook takes, knight takes, and the simple knight f3. And black dominated on f3 and e4, and white's king was open on the 7th rank. And as a consequence, rook c2 was a mistake. Adorjan sacrificed his queen with rook takes a2, and now he's winning material. Miles didn't last long. And in this position, black has the interesting idea, bishop f6, bishop d4, rook f2 mate. And there's no defense to that. So Adorjan played bishop f6. And black is up a ton of material here. White has one check. Then after king g7, there's never any checks. Then bishop d4, rook f2 mate is coming. Even if it wasn't coming, it would be completely winning for black. White's king is stalemated. And in this position, Miles resigned. So both sides thought they were tricking each other, but Adorjan won a beautiful game in the Interzonal against a very strong opponent with the black pieces. Miles was never world champion, but Miles was definitely top 10 in the world. And in 79, he was certainly top 10 in the world. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. I want to thank Thomas E. for sponsoring the lecture. If you want to sponsor a lecture, contact my wife Karen. Her information is on the screen now, and you can sponsor a lecture on any topic that you like. Today's topic was Hungarian Grandmasters of the 20th century. We went over 4 different Grandmasters: Portisch, Ribli, Sachs, and Adorjan. And in the 70s and 80s, they dominated the Hungarian scene. They played in Olympiads, played in the Hungarian Championship, and they were all top 20 in the world for quite a long time. Portisch was top 10 in the world for a long time. He's older than the other players, so he was a top player in the 60s and 70s also. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.